Looks good.
Okay. So as you can see, we've got our different layers, right? So what layer of our application is this? What would we call all of these? Views. Yeah. And this is what's going to be in the browser. And then this is going to represent what part? Controller. The routing, the controller actions. And then this is our model. And then I also have the database here so we can visualize what that looks like. So we're going to step through a registration and login process, and then we're going to see what happens as the information moves back and forth, particularly what the password looks like in each of those steps. Cool? So the very first thing, if we want to register, that's our user's new route, right? So we send a request to this route, get user/new, and this returns a form, right? So this outputs this form, and what information is going to be there in the form? What are the fields going to be called here? How can we set that up? There are going to be inputs, right? And then the names, you have a couple of different options, right? You can have it say user name, user email, and the same thing for password. Yeah, so you can already see the handwriting degrades.
Hash.
So this is going to be inside of an HTML form.
No, but your password is hashed.
It's not hashed. It looks like it is, but it's not. So this ends up here. Let's come up with a username with a very short email address to pass back in this form. Anybody have any suggestions? Joe? I like that. And what is Joe's email address? Joe@joe.co. And what is Joe's password? Password? Let's pick something slightly different. Let's just say hello. How about hello? Is everybody okay with that? Because it's going to be confusing if it's literally password with everything else that we're doing. Okay. When Joe types in hello there, is the password hashed or is it plain text? It's plain text. And then he's going to click the register button, and what route is that going to hit? What RESTful route are we talking about, or action? A post to users, which is which action? It's the create action. The path is /users. So this information gets sent back and submitted here. And what this ends up being is you have a params hash, right? And inside that params hash, because we set it up with the user containing all these fields, there's a key inside the params hash of user. And that contains all these fields. Just for brevity, I'm going to only show password here, because that's what we're mostly concerned with. But also name and email would be there. So when I say password, that's the key. What's the value? Hello. Not hashed. Plain text hello still. And then we write our controller action to either instantiate and then save a user or create it all at once, right? And what happens is, if we have our model written like this, we have some virtual attributes. Or we have one virtual attribute that has a reader and a writer. So password is our virtual attribute. Our database has a column called hash password. It does not have a column called password. But to the outside world, since we've created this virtual attribute, you can treat this attribute exactly the same as name or email. We've created the interface, the readers and the writers, right? So when we call in here something like user.create, we pass it in the user hash, which contains password, name, and email. So its name is Joe, email joe@joe.co, and password. What does the password look like right now? It's still plain text hello. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay. Still plain text hello. What happens when you call create or new is that an initialize function is called, or an initialize method, just like with any other class when you instantiate it. So what happens then is it finds these key value pairs, and it essentially runs the equivalent of saying, name. It's probably actually self.name. So it'll say self.name equals args, or whatever they've chosen to call it, name, because that's what's passed into the create call. Does everybody follow that? Any questions there? So it does the same thing for all the other parameters. So the same thing for email, and then more importantly, the same thing for password. I'm going to shorten that, but it says password. So when it calls self.password equals, a different thing happens than when you call self.name equals. When you do this, it just assigns directly Joe, and that's what ends up in the database. When it calls password equals, what happens?
Creates this hashed password here.
Yeah, it calls the password equals method that we've defined. So to the outside world, a regular attribute or a persisted attribute is treated the exact same as a virtual attribute. No difference. The implementation is a lot different, right? So at this point in time, what's inside arg's password?
Hello.
Still hello, right? When we say password equals, that gets passed here. So what is inside that variable right there?
Hello.
The word hello. And then this is a BCrypt password class, and it has a class method called create, and it takes in a string, and what does it do?
Makes the hash.
It makes the hash, right? It does a couple of other things. It creates a salt. It combines the salt and the plain text password. It hashes it. It puts some versioning information on the front. But at the end of the day, we have an object that can be represented by a very long string, right? So this is the point that we go from a plain text password to a not plain text password. And then what do we do with it?
Store that.
We call hash password equals. So that long string gets assigned here, so it ends up in the database, right? So once this is called, an ID gets generated by the database. Name is a regular attribute, so that just goes straight in here. Email is a regular attribute, so that goes straight in here. And what goes in the hash password?
The long hash string.
Yeah, whatever this created. So I'm going to do a shortened version of it, but it starts with some versioning information, like version 2A of BCrypt, and then $10 for the cost. And then I'm going to put some other notations here just to help us split it up. But it's all one big string. What comes next?
Salt.
The salt. So some randomly generated salt. I'm just going to put in like A, K, 7, 2, star. So the salt is longer than that, but we're just going to leave it there so that you don't have to watch me write the whole thing. And then after that,
The hash.
the actual hash, which is also looks like garbled text to us. So I will also shorten that. What's important about that? What are the important features of this hash that make it good for password storage?
Can be reversed.
Cannot be reversed. What else?
It creates the same hash every time.
If you give it the same input, you get the exact same hash. Because it's storing the salt, so that will be consistent. It's storing the version and the cost, so that will be consistent. So as long as your plain text password is the same input, you should get the same hash. Is everybody there on that piece? Okay, so that happened, that was successful, and then our post, we decided to redirect to the login page on successful user creation. So your browser got a redirect. Here, it returned success and a 302 redirect. So then it follows that redirect and goes to the get login. If we were talking RESTful routes, what would the get login, what would be the resource and the action that we're talking about for this controller? Session would be the resource, and what action would this be? It's a get request. New. The session new. And so that's going to return a form here where we ask for login credentials, email and password, right? So Joe's going to log in, and he actually his ID is going to be 2. So Joe's going to log in. He types in his email address. What's he type in here if he wants to log in correctly?
Hello.
Hello. The plain text password, right? And then this gets sent back to a post request to log in. And if we were talking RESTful, what resource would that be?
Sessions.
And what action? Create.
Oh, okay.
Post would be the verb, create would be the action. So this happens, and then what kind of code would you write in that controller to log someone in?
You would do like the session with ID of their password authenticate. You call authenticate on
So
that?
first, let's not worry about the session just yet.
Okay.
What kind of method is authenticate the way that it's written here? Instance. So what's the very first thing we should probably do? Get an instance of user. What information can we use to do that? The email. So we're just going to find the user by the email, right? And I'll shorten this so it won't be syntactically correct, but you find by email. And then we magically have a user instance, just like that. So now what do I do with that user instance? Call authenticate. And what do I pass to authenticate? How do I get that? It's in params. So we'll simplify it and just say that it was directly called password, right? Which is perfectly fine. So then what's going to happen? We pass it in, and what does that look like? Plain text word hello. What does this look like?
That's the hash.
It is, so this is important. The hash is used, so when I call self.password, where can I look to see what happens? In the model. Where? very specifically, where do I look?
Together.
At the getter, the reader method, right? So this is what happens, and we use the hash password string that's in the database, but it's not directly a string that we're comparing, right? We instantiate a new BCrypt password object. So we have an instance of a BCrypt password object on the left side of this, and what's on the right side? The plain text hello. And what kind of thing is double equals in Ruby? It's a method. So we know that this is a string that says hello, and we know that this is an object that's represented by a string that is decidedly not hello. And why does this work? Alias is
It's a method that BCrypt uses.
BCrypt wrote its own double equals method. And what happens inside that method is it takes this string and it basically does the same process using the same salt and the same version as this BCrypt object, so that you get the same result. Because the input is hello, that's the same, and then it's able to use this salt, that's the same, this version, this cost. All three of our inputs are the same, our output hash should be the same, given that the password is correct. Does everybody understand that part? This is like the crux of the whole thing. Okay, cool. So we authenticate, and then we have our logic that says, okay, authentication worked. We will redirect you to where we choose to do that. In my application, we're going to redirect to essentially the profile page. So this post was successful because they put in the correct password, and then this sends back a 302 redirect, and the browser follows that redirect, so it sends another request here to this action, and it's the get user's ID. So it's going to pull the user by ID, get that information, and then display this profile page. Okay? So this is going to output the name, the email, and the password. So when this is run, we find the user, and then we have some view that shows that user's information. So when that response comes back, and I'm going to send it user.name, user.email, and user.password, right? What is the name going to look like? Joe. What's the password going to look like? Some object. So it will, because of the way they've implemented it, when you output it to a file, it will look like a string. So what will password look like specifically?
That gobbledygook over
Yeah, it'll say $2A, $10, etc. Why will it say that? And can I make it say hello?
It will say that because you're calling it on, you're getting that user's specific thing, which is the hash password.
When I say user.password, the reader, the getter, depending on what terminology you like, gets that password hash. And why can't I make it say hello?
Because that's not saved in your database.
That's not saved in my database, and that hash is irreversible. Okay? So this is a very simplified look at an authentication flow. So does everybody have a pretty good understanding of when and where the password changes from plain text to the hash? Cool. Does anybody have any questions about how all of this works?
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
so because of def password and def password equals, the Ruby object user has an additional attribute password as well as, like the database has hash password, but the Ruby object has regular password.
The Ruby object in this case will have both.
Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, you're right. The Ruby object has password, and the database does not.
Yeah, I wrote it in a different way, so when I saw this was confusing to me. So that is helpful.
Cool. Yeah, and a different way isn't necessarily wrong. Like you can use a class method for authenticate,
Right.
and that's perfectly fine. The thing that I did see was some people use before hooks in their active record models, like before create hash password. That works, but I would prefer to see it this way. It's just going to be more consistent with the outside world using the password virtual attribute. But the class method versus the instance method for authenticate is, in my mind, a personal preference, not a right or wrong. Cool. I think that's it. Unless there's any other questions. Yeah.
Go over how to use before filters in the apps and controllers.
I can do that, but not for this particular subject. But yes, yeah, I can show you best practices on before filters. That it?
Cool.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yay.